Erev Tov Ramat Aviv Gimel. Good morning, Vancouver, and all of Canada through Toronto. We have so many Canadian friends who join us week in and week out. It's great to have you here with us. I see people who have logged in from Los Angeles, from Staten Island, from Miami, really from all over the country. And this has been a challenging week on the weather front for many, and our hearts go out to all our good friends in Texas, for anyone that is suffering from the weather, from the disruption, from the storms. And what a better way to come together and build community during a challenging time than to be with us here, to suspend our imaginations a little bit, to hop on a plane with Reuven and to explore one of our favorite places, one of our favorite regions that we'd like to come back to in the Galilee. For many, it is actually the Sea of Galilee. So why don't we start there? Fresh water is important to all of us. Tell us a story, put something in the chat that warms your body or warms your soul with a story from the Sea of Galilee, one that you want to share with everyone today who understands the importance of fresh, clean drinking water. And maybe going for a nice little swim. Even this time of year, you could probably get away with it certainly in Israel. We're not going to do that today, but those stories are the ones that keep us coming back together, doing these virtual tours, and really enjoying the many things that we know we'll be able to get back to. We just don't know exactly when. I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Reuven Solomon. He's taken us now, I think we're on our 12th virtual tour. We keep them coming because you keep asking for them, and more people keep joining us week in and week out on these various tours. So Reuven, I'm going to turn over to you today. I don't know whether you're going to use Capernaum, Kfar Nachum, all of them. Each time I learn a new story about both the pronunciations and the shorashim, the roots of the places that we're visiting. So tell us a little about the tour we're going to do today. I know you've got lots of material. We'll see how much we can cover. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Wayne, and a warm welcome to all our friends of the AIFL World Round. Today, we are actually going to go down to the Sea of Galilee, and it is down from almost everywhere except from the Dead Sea, because the Sea of Galilee is 200 meters below sea level. And today we're going to head down to the Sea of Galilee from the mountains of Nazareth, the hills of Nazareth. And we're going to take a journey down that was an ancient route from the time of the Via Maris, going all the way from between the ancient empires by way of the way of the sea, the Via Maris and the King's Highway, would bring you down through a valley that we're going to be traveling to. In the time of Jesus, it was certainly the way one would come from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee, about a 7-hour walk. And we use that same route today, and the route is called Through the Valley of the Doves. Unusual name. Perhaps because of the appearance of this valley, but we'll talk about it when we get to our first stop today, which will be through the Valley of the Doves and Mount Arbel. Now, since this was a route that Jesus took from Nazareth to the headquarters in Capernaum, there is a journey along this route that takes in much more than just this route, goes all around the sites of the Sea of Galilee and beyond, and that's called the Jesus Trail. It's a part of which we're going to be doing today, because we're going to be traveling through the part that takes us through the Valley of the Doves to Magdala. We'll stop off at Mount Arbel. We'll talk about events that take place there, and then we will start our journey along about 1/3 of the shores of the Sea of Galilee. As Wayne mentioned, we call it a sea, even though it's a lake. And let me tell you, the next time you see it, you're going to be amazed, because the rains that we've had have topped up the level and it's at its highest that it has been in my memory. So it's come alive, the Sea of Galilee, but 1/3 of the sea from Mount Arbel, you'll notice below Mount Arbel sits Tiberias. That's a new city in the time that Magdala was already a very well-established and wealthy town, fishing city. And further up, Capernaum, as you can see, the town we call the town of Jesus. You may remember that Matthew tells us that on the road above Capernaum, there was a custom stand, and Matthew was at that custom stand. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because journey along why would they have a custom stand? The reason they would have a custom stand there, of course, would be because you're coming between two different territories. The Galilee area, after the death of Herod the Great, none of his sons could really take over as sole ruler, so they split the empire, the Roman province, into three sections: Judea, Galilee, and Golanitis, or the Gadarenes. We're concerned with the two now, the Herod Antipas and his control of the Galilee, and his half-brother Philip and his control of the Golan, the Golantis. And thus, it's an ideal area if you intend to teach a new teaching that the authorities are not very likely to accept. Then you would be in a good position if you could crisscross from one territory to the other. When things got too hot in one area, you could easily go to another. And thus it makes a great deal of sense that the ministry is first taken around the shores of the Sea of Galilee, in between, on the border, in between the area of Herod Antipas and Philip. But once, as I said, the first stop we're going to take today is coming from Nazareth through to the Valley of the Doves. And as I mentioned, the Valley of the Doves takes us right by Mount Arbel and into Magdala. Hammam is, Wadi Hammam is its name in Arabic, which means Valley of the Doves. And trying to answer the question of where did it get its name from? Perhaps there were at one time many doves there, but it is more likely that it gets its name, and you will see this more clearly in the next slide, from the appearance of a dove heading, if you imagine the very furthermost from us, the head of the dove, with the hills to the left of Arbel, or Arbela as Josephus calls it, that we're going to be visiting, and to the right, Nitai, the wings of the dove. You can imagine a dove flying from the Sea of Galilee towards Nazareth through that valley. The very first place you would come into from that valley, as I said, was the town of Magdala, that we will also visit. But first of all, I want to share with you a little bit about Mount Arbel that you're seeing now in front of you. And it's being the site, I say this a little tongue-in-cheek because I'm talking about 40 BC, of the very first paratrooper action in history. How does this come about? Well, Mount Arbel, as you will see very shortly, has numerous cave fortresses carved into its sides that are very non-approachable from below. And when in 40 BC, when Herod is on his rise to power, Hasmonean supporters and holdouts hold out in these cave fortresses that are unassailable from down below. And Herod knows that the only way he's going to get real control out of in his reign is to root out these cave fortress defenders, and only that way will he be able to really rule. You can see a variety here of these cave fortresses that I'm talking about, but this doesn't really give you the perspective of how inapproachable they are from down below. The next slide will. Taking in the same direction, you'll see from the next slide what you have to overcome in order to get anywhere near these cave fortresses. And thus, Herod the Great comes up with a plan that I like to call the very first paratrooper action in history. First, have a look at what he has to overcome in the following slides. Quite inapproachable and easily defended from anyone coming up from below, but dropping in from above, as Herod's forces does, he places his men in cages like the one you see, the replica you see in front of you, and with grappling hooks that you see in one corner of that cage, and with the equipment for raising and lowering these cages. He lowers his men to the mouth of the caves where there are Hasmonean holdouts, and with these grappling hooks, they drag them out and toss them down below to their deaths. And this is the way Herod the Great overcomes the resistance of the Hasmoneans in the fortress caves of Mount Arbel, that incidentally Josephus calls Arbela. So the first paratrooper action in history dated around 40 BC. Now that we've passed Mount Arbel, we're coming into a recent discovery that I want to tell you much more about, Magdala. Magdala, the town of Mary Magdalene, is, in my view, going to be the #1 site around the shores of the Sea of Galilee for many, many reasons. But let me tell you the story from the beginning. Magdala, in Aramaic and Hebrew, Migdal, is actually called by Josephus and in Greek, Terrakia. Terrakia, which means the curing of fish, because this town that was first established in the even before the Hasmonean period, but became a major center in the Hasmonean period with a harbor and everything else, is in the 1st century BC and AD, a very important town, perhaps the most important around the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias was just being built as a pagan town. And here we have Migdal or Magdala or Terrakia, a wealthy fishing village city on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where a certain Mary lived, and perhaps more than likely there became a believer and follower of Jesus, because there could be very little doubt. I would dare say, I would even go as far as to say there could be no doubt that Jesus taught and preached in what we found in Magdala, a 1st century synagogue. But all of this was covered, the whole site was covered with mudslides that came from the very mountains that I showed you, from the Valley of the Doves, that covered this entire site from everyone's eyes from shortly after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, in other words, around 70 AD, right until this part of Magdala, right until modern times, right until 2007. And it's an amazing story about how it is rediscovered. Of course, we had rediscovered Magdala to the south a long time ago, and even to the north, a town called Migdal, but they were the real outskirts of Magdal, or Terrakia, and the center of it was hidden by feet of mud from the mudslides that we didn't know about. I tell you a story now of a certain father, Juan Solana, who is a Roman Catholic father, given the job in 2004 to come to Israel and to administer the Notre Dame in Jerusalem. And he tells the story of his hesitation about whether he was up to such an enormous job. Jerusalem, the very center. And for inspiration, he went to Rome. And in Rome, before he came to Israel, he goes to pray in a chapel, and he's a little doubtful of whether he's going to actually accept this enormous responsibility. When he looks up at the mosaic on the chapel that he is in, and he sees that it is a mosaic of Jesus walking on the water with Peter, and the inscription below saying, "O ye of little faith," which convinces him this is a sign he's got to take the job. One of his first nights in Israel is spent by the Sea of Galilee, and he is very taken with it. And 3 years after his appointment, it comes to his notice that there's a patch of land by the Sea of Galilee that is available on sale, and he decides that he's going to purchase it and build a guest house for pilgrims on this site. Well, in 2009, and 2007 to 2009, of course, whenever you try to build something in Israel, you have to have an archaeological survey and clearance. And lo and behold, boom, what do they find? A first century synagogue, the finest first century synagogue, pre-destruction of the temple anywhere in Israel. And proof of it being a first century synagogue with coins dating from 20 AD right up to 69 AD, the destruction of the temple. And then it's all covered with mud, and only with the foundations of this guest house being placed is this site uncovered. What was on this site before was what was called the Hawaii Hotel, which was a campground actually on mud. And here you see the background that I'm sitting in front of the site itself, Magdala, the town of Mary. I'm going to show you a short video, and we'll talk about some of the elements that we see in the video and this incredible find, the stone that we find that we call the Magdala stone. This is the synagogue itself, and you can see in the center of the synagogue the Magdala stone. And I'm going to be talking in more detail about this stone. But of course, the guest house had to be totally reoriented to the north in order to not interfere with the incredible find. And today it is complete. You're going to see this at the end of our Magdala section of this guest house that is complete today, and that already, just before this COVID-19 business, people actually stayed at. Other buildings were completed earlier, and what you're seeing here is a view around the major part, around the synagogue itself. Now, you're going to see this stone with two slots in its side. Do you see it? This stone is obviously a stone where scrolls would be placed, with the slots being holding the scroll as you would scroll to the position you wanted. This was a study scroll, and the hall you see beside it, limestone and plastered, was probably where the scrolls were kept. But of course, we found a lot of mosaic floors, and the major find that you're going to see in a moment, with still plaster on the walls with colors and so on. But surprisingly, pillars were missing. And it's only later that we discovered what happened to these pillars, and we'll come to that as well. But here you see what we call the Magdala stone. And we're going to focus on stills afterwards of this Magdala stone, because it is certainly symbolic. So the video will run, and we'll focus on the stills of this stone when we talk about its significance. But I want to show you how this stone was placed in the center of the synagogue, where one facing this stone, and you may notice on the top of it there are sort of slots where a table could sit, and perhaps on top of those slots a scroll could be read, and the reader facing the front of that where we got the appearance from would be facing Jerusalem. This was very unusual as Jerusalem stood, and it gives us a lot of hints about the reason this stone was placed there. You're looking now at why the Greeks and the Romans called Magdala Terrakia. This is the fish curing factory, not factories, but workshops, I would say, that where the fish were finely cured, packed, and sent as special delicacies to Rome. It was a very prized, Josephus tells us, luxury, and thus Thyatira became quite wealthy with its export of fish. The main route through from the northern part of the town through to the southern part of the town was the road you just saw. You're seeing here a slide of the synagogue itself with the missing pillars. Some of the stubble of some pillars remain, and they were all, of course, frescoed and painted in Pompeii style. But I'm going to focus now, as we follow on the slides, with the big find, the stone itself. Right in the center of the synagogue, what we call the Magdala stone. You're looking at it at its side. You'll notice the stone benches around, and if you were facing the front of it with the slope down towards you, you can see it sloped, short stubby legs, with the wooden legs above it, and the table with holding the scroll. One would be facing Jerusalem as one read. In the following slide, you're going to see close-ups of the table itself, and there I want to tell you a little bit about its tremendous symbolism of the temple. Remember that this table, this stone, the Magdala stone, was here in the 1st century, before the destruction of Jerusalem. And as you will see in the following slide, you're actually seeing probably the very earliest rendition of a drawing of the menorah. Here you see the other more simple stone where one would do the reading from the study room. In the following slide, you're going to go back to the Magdala stone to see its symbolism to the temple in Jerusalem. Of course, it would have been a reading reading table as well, but its symbolism should not be underestimated. You know, the person, the artist who designed this Magdala stone, obviously knew the temple, saw the temple, because the elements in it fit in with everything we know about the temple. Here you're seeing some fresco work that we can note the color, because later on I'm going to show you how in a rebuilding the same colors are used symbolically again. But I want to get to the stone itself in order to show you its symbolism. So in the following slides, you're going to see a quick view of some of the synagogue, and then we're going to focus on the stone. Here, another bit of plaster with Pompeii-like fresco. And again, and here we have the stone. You're looking at the view of the stone from where the reader would stand. And what do you see here? A menorah and something. It appears that the menorah is standing on something. It's not, because it's impossible to get the perspective in a stone architecture. What you're seeing here is the menorah, the seventh branch candelabrum, and the table before it. But they want to show you that the menorah actually is on a tripod leg, which we believe was the real base of the menorah in the temple. And this is the really earliest model of the menorah that stood in the temple, drawing of that we have. And the table that you see, that as if the menorah is standing on, is actually standing in front of the menorah, and that is the showbread table. Alongside it, on two sides, the jug that would have the oil and the water, of course. Here you're getting a view of the top of the stone itself. And here, what appear to be palm trees on the two sides are actually not palm trees. They're implements of the temple. A brush and an incense shovel on the left-hand side, and the brush, as you can see, on the right-hand side. And in the middle, a rosetta. 6 petals inside and 6 petals around, making 12, very symbolic. But why the rosetta? We believe that this was the design of the curtain separating the Holy of Holies at the back room, the very back of the temple, and we'll get to that when we go around the other side of the stone.
Wow.
And here we are already on the other side of the stone, with the Holy of Holies being on that side. Now notice 2 wheels. You'll notice that the left-hand one has its hubcap on the outside, and the right-hand one has no hubcap. That's because we're looking as if in between the 2 wheels of the chariot, and below it the triangles resembling fire, representing in those times fire. So what do we have here? We have chariot of fire, which is if you like, an allusion to the Almighty. You remember the chariot of fire that takes Elijah up into the heavens, a chariot of fire, fire seeing as the very presence of our Maker in our presence as fire. And thus, the Holy of Holies, the very back part of this stone, resembles that. On the sides, you can see, of course, what appear to be arcades in almost 3-dimensional fashion, with an olive lamp that probably lit these arcades. This find, many people believe, indicate that because Jerusalem was far enough away from places like Magdala, to go there on a regular basis would be very difficult. So once a year, perhaps on one of the festivals, you would make your trip to Jerusalem. But the other times, you would come to the synagogue, a gathering place, where you would have a resemblance of the temple. And this shows the connection of the Galilean Jews to Jerusalem and the temple itself.
Reuven, let me see if we can get a couple quick questions in before you transition. This is a gorgeous find, and I understand why you are viewing it through the lens of a prize that people are going to want to see. What Deb is asking about the size of the Magdala stone. Can you give a sense? You can almost see the scale from this picture with the person's head.
It is like a small table, I would say about maybe 50, 60 centimeters in width and 80 in length. It's maybe even up to a meter in its length. Short, stubby legs. It would come, if you stood beside it, to your knees, but if you had the wooden table that we think would have been placed on its 4 edges, you could actually use that table as a reading table if that's what they used it for as well. But it certainly was a symbol of the connection of the Galileans to Jerusalem. It is
for Americans, 2.5 by 3 feet approximately. We are getting some questions, Reuven, about the dates, just the chronology of things here. Which Leah is asking about which is older, the Magdala Synagogue or Capernaum itself?
The both synagogues existed at the same time, in the time of Jesus, in the 1st century. But the synagogue that we're familiar with in Capernaum is a 5th century synagogue. And this built as a place of worship, whereas this synagogue with the 1st century Capernaum synagogue under the present synagogue in Capernaum was before the destruction of the temple. And this is, I wouldn't say one of the oldest synagogues in Israel, because we have found older synagogues, but this certainly is the best and most decorated synagogue existing before the destruction of the temple. It is only after the destruction of the temple, when synagogues take the additional role upon themselves, not being just places of study, teaching, and preaching, but are also of worship, that the synagogue has to imitate the temple. But when this synagogue stood, it wasn't instead of the temple. It was in honor of the temple as a place of gathering and teaching and preaching. And when I say teaching and preaching, my earlier comment about having very little, in fact, no doubt, that Jesus taught and preached in this synagogue as well, even though Magdala is not mentioned by name except as Mary Magdalene in the New Testament. It is very clear from Luke 4 and from the other Gospels that Jesus preached and taught in the synagogues along his ministry. And this was certainly a synagogue that he would have taught and preached in from the 1st century.
So Rochelle is asking the related question, Reuven. So if this is not one of the oldest synagogues, where are the oldest synagogues that to be found?
Wow. I would very hard to date these synagogues, because they were meeting rooms. They were squares with stone chairs around them, and I would think that the earliest synagogues that can be identified as synagogues would be from the Hasmonean period, and we found some in the Shfela area, in the lowlands, but hard to identify because very little remains. But this is certainly one of the older synagogues, because we know of it, the level that we were exposing was from, as I said, 20 AD to 69 AD, and that can be proved by the coins found. And that also gives us proof of when it all ended with the destruction of the Romans. And in fact, Josephus was actually in Magdala to beef up the stronghold there against the Romans just before the Roman advance, Vespasian from the south. He actually, and this gives us an answer to the question that I had: what happened to all the pillars in the synagogue? They were used to barricade the main route through the center of Magdala, and you'll see that in the following slides.
One more question I'll sneak in on from Alan is asking about whether you see any animals on the stone itself, or whether there are any mosaics or anything in addition that's been found that sort of give more clues to what the synagogue was like. Mosaic, yes, and the plaster, colored plasters, but certainly no animal figures, not in the mosaics and not in the stone, because this was still a period. It is only in the rabbinical Judaism that we see mosaics of Helios, the sun god, and so on synagogue floors from the 3rd and 4th and 5th century. But in this time, of course, no graven images. Got it. Well, I'm going to let you keep going. We have lots of questions that continue to pour in here, and at least one person with a good sense of humor suggesting that Herod's invention may have been not just good for paratroopers, but also for window washing. So we'll come back to that if we have time later. Go ahead, Reuven.
Okay, so in the following slides, you're going to see Magdala as it is today. So let's move on with the slide here. First of all, you're seeing the fishing area, the fish curing area. We'll slip through these slides quickly. But as I said, Terakia, the name that this town gets from the Greeks, is because of the fish they cured. And here we found the fish works, if you like, the pools that you see that were plastered, where the fish would be kept and salted and then sent off to as far away as Rome. Here we see the barricade I spoke of and the pillars, the missing parts of the pillars. In the next slide as well, you will see the missing parts of the pillars that Josephus, Yosef ben Matityahu, as a commander of the Galilee in the war against the Jewish war against the Romans, advises the residents to place on the main route from the south through their town. And I want to show you Magdala. On the other side of the synagogue, wealthy homes. You know, the whole of the Sea of Galilee is a mikveh. So why would you need a mikveh in your home? You'd have to be pretty wealthy to do that, because these mikvot actually tap into groundwater and are filled with flowing groundwater in wealthy homes just by the synagogue. Who would live right just by the synagogue? The more wealthy. And now, following on, I want to show you some of the modern part of Magdala. Duk in altum, referred to when Jesus tells the disciples, let's go out into the deep. In that building was the first building to be completed before all the other excavation. Today, this slide is an old one. It's about 2-3 years old, because today that building that you see not complete on the other side of the synagogue is actually completed. In Duk in Altum, it's a worship site right by the Sea of Galilee. And if we enter it in the next couple of slides, you will see that it is very special in its nature. This is the gathering area where 4 small chapels, 2 on either side, are in place, and the major chapel in front of you that we'll get another look at with the boat that appears to be on the water is the larger chapel in Duk in Altum. These 5 chapels, the 4 small ones and the big one, of course, are for Christian and Catholic worship. But down below, I'm going to show you an ecumenical space for worship. Here is the major chapel. The hall you saw had 8 pillars, each one identifying one of the women of the Bible, with the 8th pillar being for all women. This is in honor of Pope Paul's letter of the dignity of women, and thus they dedicated that hall to all the women. You can imagine the preacher standing before the altar, which is on that boat, appearing to be on the water itself. In the chapels itself on the sides, I'm going to show you just a quick view of 1 or 2 of these chapels. As we see on the chapels on the side, here we have a mosaic. You know, I need to tell you that there are 250,000 small pieces of stone that make up these 4 mosaics in the 4 chapels. 250,000 tiny pieces of stone. And so the resolution is pretty good. Here you have in one of the chapels the Mary Magdalene, of course, and Jesus when he exhorts the demons from her, and she becomes a believer, Mary Magdalene. The next chapel you're going to see here is an event that actually takes place not here in Magdala, but in Capernaum, where Jairus' daughter, Talitha, is revived, brought back from the dead by Jesus when he says, "Kumi, little girl, Kumi, Talitha," get up, little girl. And these mosaics, absolutely fabulous, with thousands of little pieces of stone that makes the picture. Now, one of my favorite sites in this chapel, in this Duc in Altum, is down below, because here we have real a plaza, or if you like, of stones that was right beside the harbor in their original condition, but the synagogue of course is totally rebuilt, and there was no synagogue here. And this is the most basic type of gathering place or synagogue from before the destruction of the temple, with stone seats all around. But here they decided to build a prayer hall for all, with no particular symbols of any one of the religions, but using the colors that they found in the synagogue itself to create a space that looks like an ancient synagogue. But what I love about the synagogue is one of the most beautiful paintings that you're going to see a quick version of in the next slide, of a miracle that takes place once again on the way out of Capernaum, perhaps on the way out of Capernaum to Magdala, where a woman bleeding touches the corner of Jesus's garment and is cured. The next slide will show you what you would see today in Magdala. This is the building that now has been completed, the guest house. Absolutely beautiful. It was planned to be a little further south on top of the excavation that they didn't know was there. So it was actually moved, and today people can stay there. It's a beautiful guest house, not too expensive, and an ideal spot for pilgrims to rest and visit the many sites around the Sea of Galilee that are directly connected with Christianity. And here we have, talking about the town of Jesus, Kfar Nachum, which actually is the Hebrew name that has been Hellenized into Capernaum, the town of Jesus. Why was it called the town of Jesus? Because if you cross-reference between Matthew and Mark, Matthew talks about Jesus coming into his own city without telling us which city, and then lists a series of miracles. But Mark tells us that Jesus comes into Capernaum and then lists the same miracles. So we know that Capernaum was the headquarters of Jesus. Once again, why was the headquarters in Capernaum and not in Magdala? Because, first of all, Peter had a house in Capernaum, one of the early disciples, the first of the disciples to be gathered by Jesus, are on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And Capernaum was right on the border between the area of Herod Antipas and Philip. Now, there are a couple of mysteries we're going to try and quickly solve in Capernaum, and you're going to see what this synagogue, well, I can't show you what it looked like before the Franciscans, who got the area from the Turks in the 1700s and reassembled the rubble they found spread around into where they thought it would be. Not always were they correct, but in the next couple of slides, I'll show you before the building and then after the building of what Capernaum looked like. Now, this is the area. The walls you see are not the walls of all of Capernaum. This is what we call the Franciscan Capernaum. This was the patch of land given by the Turks to the Franciscan order, who then started to concentrate on one area in particular, and that's the synagogue, and to reassemble. The rest of the area was cleared, but not reassembled. Notice, please, on the top right-hand side, foundations of an octagonal building. Today, you can't see the foundations this way. You have to see them from underneath an enormous church that is built above them. And look at the proximity across from the houses of a church and a synagogue. And this is one of the mysteries we're going to be solving. In the next slide, you're going to see, slightly oriented differently, you're going to see what it is like more or less today, with the synagogue to the right of us and the church. Where's the foundations of the church? underneath the modern-day Church of St. Peter, the house of, built over the foundations of what was believed to be the house of Peter, the headquarters of the meeting place, closer to the sea. And look at the proximity. I want to show you one more slide of the overlay, and then we're going to concentrate on specifics. Here you see the proximity in great detail of the synagogue in the foreground and the house of Peter in the foreground, with the houses in between and around. Now, it was unheard of that there could be a town or city where there were Jews and Christians in the Byzantine period living in harmony alongside or together with each other. And thus, many looked for explanations of why that wasn't really a synagogue or the church, but quite clearly it's a synagogue that was built on top of the synagogue of Jesus, and some suggested maybe it was built by Christians as a monument. But we know from Jewish writings that Capernaum was a Jewish town, and in fact in the later period, in the 300s and 400s, the Mishnah and the Talmud speak of heretics in this town. But we know that it was a Jewish town, and from the church itself and from pilgrims like Egera, who was here in 381. She spent 3 years in the land. She wrote volumes, and she writes that she is here in Capernaum when she sees that the house of Peter is being enlarged and a church is being built around this site. So we know that that there was a coexistence here between Jews and Christians, and we'll talk about it in a moment. But let's follow with the slides. This is the church that I bite my tongue not to make any comment about its beauty or lack of beauty, but it certainly does not interfere with the archaeology below it, because these pillars you see around it actually have it perched above the ruins of the house of Peter that one can see from below. And if one stands underneath the floor of this church, one can actually see the ruins of a first century house. But around this first century house, already in 381, the walls of the octagonal church, the foundations of the walls of the octagonal church that Egera has told us about, being expanded and built in her time. In the next couple of slides, I want to show you the synagogue and the houses in between. You know, I wish I had time to go into detail about more of the houses and the way they were built and how it helps us understand how a miracle like lowering the lame man through the roof of a house, as happens in Capernaum, could occur with packed houses being easily removed to lower a man through. But here you see the synagogue rebuilt on top of the first century synagogue that stood here in the time of Jesus. And in the next couple of slides, I want to show you a little more of the synagogue, and we're going to try and solve two mysteries. Here's a beautiful view of the synagogue itself with its facade facing the house of Peter, the church itself on the other side, with the right-hand room, of course, being the study area and play area and so on, and the left hand being the synagogue itself. You can see the terrible mistake that the Franciscans made when they placed the upper doorway way up too high, because if you look at the shorter pillars, we know that they would have held alcoves on the side, which was the women's section. Now, wait a minute, women's section? That didn't occur, of course, in first century synagogues, because the synagogue was a place of gathering and not a place of worship. But once the temple is destroyed, a synagogue has to take on a whole new purpose. It has to be a temporary replacement temple. So it has to look grander. It can't be the square blocks around with a small table that you read the Torah from. It has to look like a temple. And it would have in the front of it a Torah ark, where the Torah scrolls would be kept. And this Torah Ark, like all synagogues, would have to face Jerusalem, so that when the scrolls are taken out and read, then everyone in the whole world would be facing Jerusalem. If you're in Israel, you face Jerusalem. If you're in America, you face Israel. And if you're in Jerusalem, you face the Temple Mount. So everyone is worshiping in the same direction. Look at the direction of the front of this synagogue, and it doesn't face Jerusalem. Jerusalem is more properly faced in the bottom left-hand corner. And we know this was a synagogue because of Aramaic inscriptions. We also know that they must have the Torah scrolls, but they didn't have a Torah Ark. So what could the solution be? We think perhaps they had a movable ark, and we'll see that in a moment in some of the, a hint of it, in some of the lintel work and ruins we found in the synagogue. You can see what I meant about that doorway being way too high, with stairs from the outside allowing the women into the two alcoves. The next couple of slides are going to show you the lintel work found around. And here, very interesting, once again, you see the rosette, you see the Star of David. Don't have time to talk too much about it being a modern day symbol of Judaism. In the times prior, it was actually just a geometrical design. However, it seems, because we don't call it the Star of David, we don't call it the Star of David, we call it the Shield of David, Magen David. And thus, it may have been the geometric design that King David had on his shield, which makes it an appropriate Jewish symbol. In the next couple of slides, you're going to see some more lintel work that will give us a clue as to the Jewishness of the city. Look at this Corinthian capital, very Roman and Greek, but look at what its center is, the menorah. The 7-branch candelabrum on the left-hand side. You see the incense shovel on the right-hand side. You see the ram's horn. Very Jewish. In the next slide, I want to show you what probably is the hint to what I said about the Ark of the Covenant, the Torah Ark in the synagogue. Here we have, as part of the synagogue decorations, a chariot, you see the wheels, with a temple-like building on the chariot. And the chariot is obviously something that is moved. And it tells the story, perhaps, of the return of the Ark of the Covenant. We spoke about this when we toured Tel Marisha, when we went through Bet Shemesh and spoke about the return of the Ark of the Covenant and why it was returned and so on. But here, perhaps, this story that happened way before the synagogue was built, way before, and way away from where the synagogue is built. But yet they use this symbolism, and perhaps this is a hint that the Torah scrolls in the synagogue itself was on a fancy cart that would be wheeled out in the right direction for prayer time. Only a thought, but it seems like if they didn't have a permanent ark, they must have had something they could move into place. Now to get to the main question. How could it be a synagogue with Jews and a Christian community living together during Byzantine times? Unheard of. But when you think about it, it could occur if you recognize something that happened much later in history in Israel, in the 1950s, with the kibbutz movement. You know, in the 1950s, the kibbutz movement, one of the major kibbutz movement, split. They split because of ideological reasons. Some of the members said, hey, we're going to see a video as I talk. Some of the members said, hey, we're looking towards Russia and Stalin as our inspiration. This is before he was discovered as the monster he was. And other members said, no, no, no. We're looking towards the West and social democracy. And they were so ideologically motivated, I'm talking about the 1950s, so ideologically motivated that families split. There were a few cases of husbands and wives who used perhaps as an excuse, but also split. But families split over this issue. But when they split, in most cases, what they did was to take the belongings that they were entitled to as a percentage of the commune and move literally, in many cases, across the road and set up a new kibbutz. That's why you have Givat Chaim Ichud, Givat Chaim Miyuchad, Ashdod Yaakov Ichud, Ashdod Yaakov Miyuchad. The split of this kibbutz movement caused a split in ideology. But they did not become enemies. They still visited each other. They traded with each other. They even loved each other. And they lived in harmony together, even though they took their ideology so seriously that they actually physically split about this. Well, here, my contention is, this is what happened in Capernaum. You may remember that Jesus, in his teachings, says, woe to Chorazin, Jerusalem, and Capernaum, because if what he had done in these places, he would have been done in Sodom, Sodom may have been saved. So we know that not all of Capernaum became followers of Jesus, but certainly a good number did. And they didn't become enemies. They lived alongside each other, and they lived together with each other, each following his own ideology. Those who follow Jesus saying, this is the answer, and those who follow the old standard way say, look, you know, we're sticking with what we believe in. And they lived in total harmony until actually the destruction of Capernaum first of all by earthquake and later on in the Persian period. So not everyone accepts this explanation of the coexistence of the two people, and certainly in the 4th and 5th century, many non-Jewish Christians came and moved into Capernaum. But for the first, I would say, 100 years after Jesus, Capernaum was a city of Jews and Judeo-Christians living alongside each other and setting the basis for harmoniously getting along with each other despite their different religious beliefs. We have a little time maybe for questions, Wayne?
Well, Reuven, I think actually I'm going to, we have time for one, because this presentation has made it very clear that anyone who watched it and participated is likely to go visit and be part of this parade of visitors to see Magdala and to see the entire region. So the question is that several people ask, what's the name of the guest house? Because a lot of people are ready to sign up.
Magdala.
Magdala is the name of the guest house as well? Great.
Yeah.
Well, look, Reuven, you had at least two themes that we can directly connect the dots to our very next two webinars that we're doing. On Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, we will be continuing our series of multi-faith webinars. And I just love your takeaway. I don't know if you can prove it or not, but I love the spirit of the idea that people who believe differently than you don't have to be your enemies, but could actually just be people who you live with, who live around you, who have a different ideology. And certainly the kibbutz movement is one example of that. And in the faith-based community, if you attend our webinar on Wednesday, you'll get to hear about one of the most diverse communities really in the United States and possibly in the world, in the San Francisco Bay Area, how members of different faith communities have come together during the challenges of this time, seeking hope and inspiration. And for those of you that are interested and intrigued, like me, in the diversity of the ancient synagogues that Reuven shared with us during this presentation, you may also have an interest in the diversity and various types of synagogues from the modern area in the diaspora. For many of you, you might have gotten the first lesson of that at Beit Hatfutzot in the incredible models that they have there of the synagogues. And over the years have come back to see that museum expand its mandate as the Museum of the Jewish People. Well, next week, if you join us next Sunday, we're going to have a special tour with the curator of a new version of this incredible museum in Tel Aviv on our regular Sunday program. So we want to invite you to a sneak preview of the newly named and newly the new shiputs, the new version of this incredible jewel of a museum. So we're grateful today that we got to share one of our favorite spots, one of Reuven's favorite spots of historical prominence to people of different faiths. We are going to continue to take you to places you've seen and places you haven't seen, and whet your appetite for coming back for more. So for all of our friends, we hope you'll have a safe week. We hope you continue to be inspired by this series, and remind you why we have so many friends for Israel, but also how we can make new friends by sharing these stories and sharing the series with your friends and family during this challenging time. So thanks to everyone. We look forward to seeing you again on the webinar series. Have a great week.
Shalom. We'll see you again.